So I think that we can start. Thank you for being here for this second day. We will continue our collective reflection with two main speakers, Corinne Mellul and Pierre Memelde. We will end today this forum with a summary of the risk, which I will present to you, and with a proposal to continue to think and work together. So the first speaker is my colleague, Corinne Mellul. As you know, a few years ago, the keywords were disruption, new technologies, and the fourth industrial revolution. And of course, one of the many questions was to understand how these trends would have an impact on higher education. This is why we've decided to create an IFCU Foresight unit, which is run by Professor Corinne Mellul, who I'm pleased to welcome and to congratulate for her work. This Foresight unit engages in various forward-looking activities that supply information and innovative thinking on the transformations of the global educational context. Through horizon scanning techniques, it aims to observe developing trends across institutions of higher learning worldwide and assess where challenges and opportunities will arise in the near to medium-term future. Among our topics of interest, I would like to underline Technologies Watch, Workplaces of Tomorrow, and University Governance. This Foresight unit has developed several activities, training in perspective, international survey. For instance, Corinne is currently working on a survey about the qualifications for university teaching. We also publish reports. We received this morning, I think, a book titled The Fourth Industrial Revolution in Higher Education and Work, which includes, in fact, two reports written by Corinne, and you will find inside this report some parts that are directly related to the topic of our forum. So thank you, Corinne, for your commitment and for sharing your thoughts about the present crisis with us. I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Francois. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the opening of day 2 of this forum on internationalization. I was going to start by expanding a little bit on the kind of work that I do at the International Federation of Catholic Universities, but I think that Francois already did that. So I'm just going to emphasize a little bit the trend watching dimension of the work that I do, because it is particularly relevant to my subject for this forum, which is, will COVID-19 and internationalization as we know it? Trend watching, which is researching on an ongoing basis through multiple sources, developments in the higher education sector, in order to identify rising trends that may become significant or may even constitute a game changer in the near to medium term future for at least part of the sector at global level, if not the entire sector, is the kind of basic work that I do, which then goes on to feed the kind of endeavors and activities that Francois just mentioned. And of which, indeed, one of my key outputs is this annual report that either provides an overview of these global trends or focuses on some of them while trying to propose a critical assessment. Given that this is the main core of the work that I do, you can imagine that since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, roughly in March of this year, I've really had my hands full. I've had my hands full over the past few months. And what I mean by that, of course, is how much of an impact the coronavirus crisis has had already on higher education across the board and across the globe. One of the trends I've been watching in particular in this respect is, of course, the trend of internationalization, simply because it's being among the first things to go after the onset of the pandemic. So in addressing my subject of today, in other words, what impact the COVID-19 crisis is likely to have in the future on internationalization in the higher education sector, I'm first going to situate the process of internationalization in time so that everyone attending can have a clear idea of how potentially momentous, and I insist on the word momentous, how potentially momentous this impact may turn out to be at some point in the future. Then in the second part, I'm going to focus more specifically on the subject of the day, which is the impact, the possible impact of COVID, how the pandemic has already affected international enrollment across multiple institutions of higher learning worldwide. And then finally, in a concluding part, short part, I will offer some reflections on what may be under the impact of the pandemic, and as one of the consequences, one of the multiple consequences of the pandemic, the irreversible transformations of the institutional models, really, that we've known until now. So I will share with you only one slide, which is my outline, if I can find it. Let me see. I have several slides here. There's just this one slide with my outline, as you can see. Can everybody see it? Is it in shared screen? Oh, no. Okay. I need to share. All right. Can you now see it?
We hope.
Okay, it's a simple slide with my outline, which, as you can see, is super simple for today. I don't really have, it's still early, I think, to be able to find a lot of visual data, you know, in charts and pie charts form. There is a little bit, but it's still, for understandable reasons, and because the back to school period is still underway in very uncertain conditions across the world, it is very difficult to find data that can be presented in visual form. So I'm going to basically leave it for now to this single slide that just has my outline. Okay, so the rise of internationalization in higher education. Again, this is putting historical context, even though I'm sure a lot of you, or most of you, or all of you know most of what there is to know about the rise of internationalization. I found it necessary to go back to context and historical context in order to, after that, be able to simply convey the possible, once again, potential momentous change that may be in the wings. So internationalization in the higher education sector has basically soared alongside the rise of globalization, specifically starting in the 1990s, in the context of the end of the Cold War and the emergence of information and communication technologies, ICTs, both of which combined put at the top of political agendas across the world the imperative of developing a knowledge economy. In that context, internationalization became a full strategic approach embedded in the governance of a growing array of colleges and universities across the world. A move not only supported, but also prompted by all the major international organizations that are part of global governance, from the UN to the OECD, the EU, UNESCO, of course, the World Bank, and many others, and by multiple national governments. The result of this dramatic confluence of factors has been, over time, to turn internationalization into one of the most significant agents of transformation in higher education in many decades, primarily in the developed world, but also increasingly in emerging and developing economies. If you'll excuse me for a moment, just a sip of water. Gradually, the international mobility of students and faculty, the growing competitiveness of research across institutions of higher learning worldwide, the rising prestige of international rankings, and the ensuing need for institutions to brand and to market their reputation, their image, have become the hallmarks of this trend toward the ever increasing internationalization of tertiary education. Most significantly, the rise of internationalization came to supply a growing source of revenue for multiple universities, a factor that is particularly important for institutional models that rely heavily on tuition fees for part of their funding. Considering that, to quote only one figure in this presentation, the number of international students enrolled in universities worldwide doubled, simply doubled over the past decade. In other words, since 2010, between 2010 and 2020, just before the onset of the pandemic, the number of international students enrolled in universities across the world has doubled in just 10 years. Globalization, on the other hand, has also pressured universities to rescale their activities, to engage in franchises and joint ventures, to open branch campuses abroad, and also to seek direct investment from the private sector, so that both movements, globalization and internationalization of higher education, have become so intricately connected, intertwined, as to be virtually undistinguishable from one another. Among leading universities, in other words, among universities that had the means, the wherewithal to fully master this new emerging landscape, the competition to attract international talents able to increase their global standing as research institutions in particular, became as fierce as in any private sector market. And this development in turn caused already the traditional values that drove the international activities of higher education in the past, in olden days, such as increase in exchange and cooperation, the pursuit through mutual understanding of peace and solidarity among nations, to recede from the top of the agenda at leading institutions for the benefit of competition, generating revenue, boosting image and branding, and so on and so forth. More recently, though, as a reaction to this trend, a movement emerged both in the EU, in the European Union, and the United States to demand renewed focus on the quality of curricula, the inequality of access to international education, clearly reserved for the main part to a tiny fraction of the student population worldwide, and generally the alarming character of the market direction that internationalization was taking, while emphasizing, on the other hand, the need to enhance the qualitative dimensions of internationalization, such as civic education, employability, improving the quality of research rather than the quantity of publications, and cultivating the mission of service to society. Thereby, this counter movement has been seeking to put forth the broad message that internationalization should not be a goal to be pursued for itself, but only as a means to make an overall contribution to the well-being of the global society. Okay, so we have to keep in mind this broad context of rising internationalization in parallel with globalization over the past roughly 20, 30 years. And then this more recent, perhaps over the next between 10 and 5 years, counter movement demanding to put more perspective, more ethics, and more quality in the internationalization effort. Now, you may think I've already perhaps taken too much of your time focusing on the past when my talk is supposed to be on the future of internationalization in a post-pandemic era that frankly is nowhere in sight for now, which make things rather difficult to predict and forecast. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it was important for me to describe the extent to which internationalization has transformed the higher education landscape at global level over the past few decades, so that you can grasp the potential watershed that the pandemic may come to represent in the context that has prevailed so far. So my second part on COVID and internationalization will be shorter, mainly because little is clear yet on how long the pandemic will last, and therefore to what extent it will indeed bring about irreversible transformations in the higher education sector. So now to COVID and internationalization. Forgive me for opening the second part with a kind of bittersweet reference to the title of this forum, Catholic Universities Without Borders, to observe that since the beginning of the pandemic, we've had nothing but borders. Borders has been the key word to this pandemic. Of course, higher education has been among the sectors not only most affected, but also most immediately affected by the COVID crisis, as universities across the world closed their campuses and countries their borders in response to national lockdowns. And it's of course not an overstatement to say that as a result of these measures, which at one level or another, under one form or another, are still prevailing across the world, international enrollment for the current semester across most, if not virtually all universities, has come to a sudden halt. The crisis has affected multiple aspects of the lives of international students, from the continuity of learning, the uncertainty of their legal status in the host countries, the delivery of financial aid grants, to probably the most adverse consequence because of its potential to outlast the pandemic, the students' very perception of the value of their degree and of the value of studying abroad altogether. Online learning, I'll stop the sharing because I think by now you probably know this slide by heart. Not a big effort between you and me. Online learning then, which of course has been quickly put in place by universities to ensure the continuity of learning, has had uneven quality of delivery across institutions and has often penalized international students more than domestic ones for all kinds of reasons, because of time differences, because of inequality of access to the internet in off-campus settings, et cetera, et cetera. By and large, most institutions, as well as international students, have expressed since then, since the beginning of the pandemic, and you can see this in the professional literature, the view that online learning is indeed a poor substitute for a full international learning experience, which brings, of course, international exposure, proficiency in a foreign language, networking opportunities that can last for a lifetime, and in many cases, access to a foreign job market. In other words, the very drivers of international student mobility so far. At institutional level now, at present, and presumably at least in the near future, the consequences of the pandemic will incur significant damage to the funding model of those universities that rely in great part on tuition income and where international students usually pay higher tuition fees than domestic ones. Added to decreased domestic enrollments that we can already forecast due to the economic consequences of the pandemic, this may indeed spell the end of any kind of financial sustainability for many institutions, in particular in the US, in Canada, in Australia, and in the UK. At the very least, the crisis will affect core education services and the financial support provided to domestic students, as well as research and development activities, as exemplified in the fact that countless universities in these countries already have furloughed hundreds upon hundreds of adjunct faculty, administrative, maintenance staff, et cetera, et cetera. The OECD, which tracks international student flows every year, has pointed out in its 2020 report on education, called Education at a Glance, I recommend its reading, that its future reports may well, and I quote here, may well reveal, future reports of education department at OECD may well, quote, reveal a sharp reversal of trends in the year that COVID-19 struck, unquote. That certainly speaks for itself. The 2020 edition also underscores that this crisis has, at the end of the day, exposed the value proposition of universities. As students, both domestic and international, are unlikely to be prepared to spend large amounts of money in the future on online education. Online education that doesn't provide the added value of meeting people, of interacting with faculty, and generally experiencing social life on campus. So as I conclude this talk, you may well wonder if in the midst of all this gloom and doom, there may be a silver lining or perhaps an opportunity somewhere. I would answer at this point that the jury is still out on this particular item. But one thing I believe is already certain, and that is that if online learning does expand, as predicted by multiple actors, actually since the beginning of the pandemic, to become a norm or a quasi-norm, because universities either moderately or severely affected in their funding model by the consequences of the pandemic will, for example, realize through the crisis what economies of scale they can achieve through digitalization, then the going massively online won't be sufficient, and this is what I predict, won't be sufficient to retain relevance. Many universities and colleges will, beyond that, have to really reinvent learning environments such that digitalization at the most will complement, will enhance, but will not replace student to instructor, student to student, in-person interactions. Now, how this may be done is a good question, but it's still very hard to see in the current conditions of the pandemic. On the other hand, and I will conclude with this, if online learning does become the norm as a result of the pandemic, this may in turn spell a whole new future, spell out a whole new future for internationalization under an entirely new definition this time, through an expansion of the unbundling of higher education that is already underway, and that will perhaps allow institutions of higher learning to recruit students piecemeal, one by one, mainly in non-accreditation formats all over the globe. So we will be able to talk about internationalization, but in a totally different scenario, a scenario that will amount to indeed a complete redefinition of the core missions of the universities, such as they have prevailed in higher education for centuries. And that indeed is momentous, will be momentous if this is what happens. And that is the reason I insisted from the beginning on the word momentous. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Thank you very much, Corinne, for having reminded us in which context, in fact, this crisis, the coronavirus crisis, took place. In fact, you remind us that universities have entered a process of globalization, which has resulted in the creation of a global education market, And this market, as you underlined, is reflected in the recognition of diplomas, which has enabled strong student and teacher mobility, but also greater competition between higher education establishments. And we could also mention the importance now of rankings, which constitute both an index, a sign, and also a barometer of this situation. And you mentioned that this internationalization process of universities results in registering foreign students on the campus, on the foreign campus, the creation of some international brand policy, and also by a greater concern for student satisfaction. But at the same time, you mentioned the several impacts of the coronavirus crisis on this situation. You mentioned the new role, the new importance of borders, borders at a key word, you said, of this pandemic. And you also underlined the several damages on our current situation in terms of financial sustainability, on the core education services that our universities offer. And at the end, you mentioned all the problematic that we have to deal with online learning. So thank you very much. And I think that all these topics you mentioned would be very interesting to discuss with all the participants.
Summarize the whole work of analysis and collection, we can show this graphic. I'm sorry for the quality of the graphic. I haven't been able to find a better one. It's an ongoing process where all information is looked and assessed and put into hypotheses and come back to look after new information and so on. It's a never-ending process to assess hypothesis or scenario. It's the same thing in this presentation. It's very easy, in fact, to identify risk and to map this risk. For example, this is a political risk map for 2020, where green is pretty good situation and red bad situation. You can map risk for economic situation. This is almost the same colors sharing between the countries. Or you can have, and this one is very harmful, map of the COVID-19 in the US recently. Mapping the risk is also a question of severity of the risk and risk probability, where each situation is assessed in order to see which risk is the most catastrophic and frequent, and which risk is the most improbable and impact is severity is negligible. In this matrix, we can say the COVID-19 was extremely improbable, almost in terms of its consequences on our daily lives. As said one of the participants, all our lives are based on movements, on traveling, on sharing with people abroad. So today we are all blocked in our countries, in our offices. This is exceptional. Planning the risk, in fact, to forecast, to predict the risk, is first identify the risk you are exposed to locally, nationally, regionally, internationally. Assess their probability and severity, impact on your organization. Define keywords, information, events which define them. Set up a platform to monitor. This is a technological approach. Particular events close to your premises, travelers or students. Generic risk. Issues or trends which can impact your activities, as economic, for example. Group define risk by indicators and scenarios that are linked to. Finally, sort alerts following the risk map. Disseminate early warning to person in charge of specific risk. Use these alerts to populate an analysis tool to anticipate evolutions. Following risk probability change, then start response plans to scenarios. Various scenarios are more and more probable. To come back to my very brief classification of risk, each risk, the academic, operational, security, and strategic ones, have three kinds of scenarios: the optimistic one, the realistic one, and the pessimistic one, for example. Scenario A1, A2, A3. Each scenario is described by its indicators and outcome, and following the alerts you receive from monitoring tool or the monitoring of your network locally or internationally, you can step by step say the scenario A2, the realistic one, or the scenario A3, the pessimistic one, will come the future, but the close future, not the long future. Scenario and hypotheses are created. The first step of the process is to identify all potential hypotheses and scenarios, preferably using a group of analysts with different perspectives to brainstorm the possibilities. The analysts then list evidence and arguments, including assumption and logical deduction for and against each hypothesis or scenario. Using a matrix, the analyst applies evidence against each hypothesis or scenario in an attempt to disprove as many theories as possible, or to say this scenario will not happen because we don't have any information to confirm it. Refinement, the analyst reviews the findings, identifies any gaps, and collects any additional evidence needed to refute as many of the remaining hypotheses as possible. Inconsistency, the analysis then seeks to draw tentative conclusion about the relative likelihood of each hypothesis. Less consistency implies a lower likelihood. Sensitivity, the analyst tests the conclusion using sensitivity analysis, which might weight how the conclusion would be affected if a key evidence or arguments were wrong, misleading, or subject to different interpretations. Sorry. Conclusion and evaluation. Finally, the analyst provides a decision maker with his or her conclusion, as well as a summary of alternatives that were considered and why they were rejected. The analyst also identifies milestones in the process that can serve as indicators in future analysis. I show you two examples. This method is coming from the intelligence world. Each hypothesis is classified and noted. And you can see the most probable one are the greener one, the C1, where each indicator's early warning alerts are coherent or incoherent or neutral towards each scenario. But once you have done this already very important work of analysis of what is going on and what is the future, the best tool to train the people, to train the teams inside the university or collective teams is serious games. It's an example from the competitive intelligence activity I am teaching. Define the competitive issue or scenario you want to study, assign players to competing teams, give the scenario to the team, explain who they will be competing against, and describe the current conditions, context, in the industry segment, product segment, or other area of study. Give the teams 1 hour to develop a strategy that they believe is the best for the company they are representing. Give each team 5 minutes max to share its strategy with the whole group in a short presentation. After the teams have shared their strategies, send them back for another hour to develop a new strategy based on what the older teams have done. Repeat step 5 and 6 through at least 4 cycles, 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days. Debrief the group. Again, it's a heavy procedure, but if you have a group of risk managers through a network of universities, they can each year or 2 times a year meet or discuss through our technological tools like Zoom about what are the most probable or the less probable scenarios that can impact the activity of the university, and then step by step, thanks to alerts, assess the probability and the severity of any scenarios. To be a good risk manager in this situation or to try to use these tools, the needs are train teams conducting ongoing scenario-based analysis, monitoring tools alerting teams about events and keywords, integrated decision-making process, establish procedure and train person in charge. The limits of this approach are monitoring continues to collect more and more information. For example, to come back to the COVID-19, we had the information about beginning pandemic in China, but the early warning signals were not taken into account by the decision makers. Analysis requires means, time, and integrated decision, which is not always the case in our institution. Risk mitigation is not crisis management. It takes time and involvement of all the people. Never-ending task, because the situation is always evolving, leading to a procedure fatigue. And low involvement, as people always underestimate probability and impact of risk. Again, the example of the COVID-19 is very good because nobody has never imagined that the whole world should have been stopped, freezed by a pandemic. To come back to the specific case of University of Strasbourg as the risk manager, in France, it's very institutionalized. He is nominated by the Defense and Security Ministry of Higher Education and Research Officer, who is a civil servant. His tasks is assisting the university president for the defense and security issues. He is in charge to identify, assess, mitigate risk as to develop specific contingency and continuity plan, as for example, against terrorism, which is an important risk in France. He is in charge in particular to deploy national directive against economic and scientific espionage, another kind of risk. He is in charge to raise awareness among all university personnel in charge and staff. His position here in Strasbourg, the local security and defense officer, is the general director of the university, administrative, not educative line of command. He is positioned at the highest level, directly by the president of the university, in charge of coordinating all administrative tasks, and thus aware about the whole university life. He is seconded by a deputy coming from the Research Corps, CNRS, and thus aware about the intellectual property and espionage issues. They are in contact with the local and national authorities, the Ministry of Higher Education, evidently, but also the Ministries of Defense and Interior, and part of a national-wide network of security and defense officers of universities. To conclude, the qualities of a risk manager are: he has to be or she has to be deeply involved in the university life, processes and command lines, has good relationships, abilities to build an internal and international network, to be able to have early warnings and trends analysis coming from all over the places, risk and crisis management abilities, but also research and analytic ones, which are more rare in most of the people, for most of the people I know. Ability to delegate to deputies. He is not an outsider. He is not a one-man show. He has to be seconded, as shown in my example, but he has to have a strong network of people in charge all over the faculties and the institution inside the university. He has the ability to train and empower persons in charge of specific issues. In conclusion, we can imagine all the situations, we can anticipate most of them, we can prevent and prepare persons to be able to respond to any kind of situation, but we have to be conscious of the whole kind of risk our institution or the companies also are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you very much for this presentation.
I've been very speedy.
No, it's okay. Don't worry. I think that it was really complementary to that of Marie-Claude yesterday. Marie-Claude focused on crisis management.
I saw. Very
Yes,
interesting.
and you have another subject which was more focused on the position of risk manager. What is a risk manager, and also what are the methods that can be used for that? And if we have any doubt about the necessity to be really professionalized, I think that your presentation can remind us that we must train if we want to organize a real risk management team. We can't just improvise something. We must be prepared and have some specific position in the board of our university. So your first part was very interesting about the intelligence approach. It is related with what I will say about the mapping of risk, but you also mentioned this necessity of mapping risk. You remind us that several methods exist for preparing the future. And I think that the example you took about the University of Strasbourg is very relevant.
It's not the only one to have this organization.
Yes,
just,
exactly.
I know the organization here because I am teaching here, but
and probably we could compare this situation with some other worldwide.
So, I think that's what's important to retain from your presentation is that improvising ourselves as risk manager is not an easy task, and to understand the amplitude of the task can bring a lot of empathy for our co-workers that work in the field, and to participate actively in the development of those scenarios with the knowledge that our participants have about the particular context in specific countries and at destination is where I believe they can really bring in some very interesting information to risk managers in universities. So on that level, I think your presentation was great and can help clearly everyone understand the position and participate in identifying the risks that are related to international activities within their institution. So thank you, that was really interesting.
Thank you very much. So Spencer Omar Montes is asking,
yes,
how much costs this system to implement a university? To be frank, I never done any proposition to university for this kind of tools. I can assess the cost in terms of means. You need to have 1 or 2 persons in charge of risk management in university, at least 1, but 2 is good because 1 is administrative, the other 1 is understanding the dynamics of exchange of information and in the university. For the software part of the technological part of the solution, you can make a monitoring system for free. In fact, it's easy, but it takes time to process all the information you collect. Or you have some solution which costs some, let's say, $10,000. There is a cost, but they are very useful tools. For the methods, you have to be to train yourself for the methods, and there are a few masters or diplomas all over the world training people to analysis and risk management. So it's also a question of training yourself. But if you do your academic research, most of the methods I presented are very well explained and available on the internet. So the cost is not very high. Finally, it's not an existing system. It's an assembly of method and software, and a very specific environment, which is, for example, at the University of Strasbourg, they don't have any software for that. They are only using the internal networks of correspondents of the university to assess the risk. And they are in contact with the local authorities, police and armies, and the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Higher Education. So it's mainly an exchange of system. But Spencer, again, if you need some indication, I can send you example of software.
I may add a comment. In fact, for a part, of course, this forum that we have now, at the beginning of a process, the idea was to sensibilize you and sensibilize all the universities to this topic. And perhaps that the next steps will be to propose you some specific trainings so that you can better know what are at first the risks that your university face, and then perhaps that some other trainings will be more focused on this risk manager position. But as Pierre Memel has just said, and also Marie-Claude, at the end of the process, you must have a team manager, risk manager management team, and it is in fact a long process. We can be just, we can help you in this process, but at the end, the work will be you will have the responsibility to create and train a specific risk manager position in your university if you are interested in these topics.
Thank you.
So, are there some other questions? No. So, perhaps. No. Okay. So, I take the floor.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, thank you very much, Pierre, for your presentation and for having answered to the questions.
Thank you.
It was difficult for me. I have to share my screen, so I will try to do it. Is it okay for you? Okay, can you tell me?
Yeah, it's working.
It's working.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's working, but I have any. I don't know exactly what you see on the screen. Do you see just my PowerPoint?
Yes, apparently the cover slide connecting the world of Catholic higher university, higher education.
Okay, you see that.
With the red background.
Okay, red background. And now what kind of risk? Is it okay?
Yeah, it works.
Okay, thank you. There is just one participant who follows me, but thank you very much, Corinne.
Yeah.
So,
whatever helps.
Yesterday we heard the panelists explain what the impact of the crisis had been on universities and how their own universities were organized to face this crisis. And on several occasions, yesterday and today, we've mentioned risks which affect our universities. In addition, Marie-Claude yesterday and Pierre just now showed us that risk management cannot be improvised and is of course based on professional practices. My intervention is intended to be both a kind of synthesis of what has been said before about the risks and also a transition to collective work to which I invite the participants to join if they wish, of course. I will therefore first list the risk mentioned since yesterday, risk to which I have added a brief mapping with other known risks. If we want to professionalize our approach, I believe that we must adopt in a collective process a three-step approach that I'm initiating now. Map the risk. Pierre has just told us a few words about it. Reflect together on a framework for Catholic academic risk management. I will go back to this topic, which is very important according to me. And finally, trainers in risk management. I will therefore list and briefly explain some risk. It fits to what Pierre has called an intelligence approach. And I have just listed, in fact, 10 kinds of risk that could occur or that concern our campuses. The first one is organizational risk. What I mean by organizational risk? In fact, I would like to emphasize two important aspects here. Our institutions are universities. As such, they are based on a very specific organization, a delimitation of powers, a particular structure between faculties, institute, business schools sometimes, and so on. And this first aspect must be taken into account to understand how a risk management team can be put together. If I want to be very clear, I could say that a university is not exactly a company, and so we have to take into account some differences in terms of organization. But there is also a second aspect, which is perhaps more important according to me. This second aspect to take into account concerns the Catholic identity, the Catholic identities of our establishments. Our organizations all bear the trace of this identity in their hierarchical structure, but also through the identity of the managerial staff. And this can constitute an important fact to take into account and can sometimes, often, according to me, create a fragility, a risk for universities in their development, in the onset of crisis, and sometimes in their capacity to face external risk. Legal risk and financial or accounting risk. I think that Marie-Claude has already noticed these two topics yesterday when she talked about procedures, for instance. Legal risk, we know that unlike private economic operators, the management of legal risk within higher education establishments has been the subject of relatively recent attention. This phenomenon knows different realities and scale depending on the continent, and it is a very important topic nowadays. Financial and accounting risk, accountable to citizens for the management they make of public resources. Higher education institutions have for a long time put in place processes to control and manage financial and accounting risk. All that is included in what I think Marie-Claude has delineated as procedures yesterday. So I don't want to be too long on these two aspects, but according to the country, I know that these two aspects are very, very important. I would like also to underline another risk, psychosocial risk. Law obliges as employers to prevent risk and promote the well-being of workers while performing their work. And this topic is also more and more important in our university, public and private universities, but perhaps more important in private and Catholic university, because we just affirm a lot of values. And of course, if there is a gap between the values we affirm and the values we practice in our work, in the well-being of workers, it will be denounced. And so, as we know, there are different levels of prevention that focus on the individual, the group, and all these three levels of prevention must be taken into account in our universities. Political risk. I think that the subject is very important also. There are two parts, in fact, in this topic. We know that academic institutions must deploy significant resources to prevent and manage political and reputational risk. And this phenomenon has evolved in such a way that the resources devoted to it are gradually taking up an increasing share of institutional budgets. I know that in the United States, for instance, this topic is very, very, very important, and some of our universities have included in their board some specialists of lobbying, lobbyists, for instance, for working and dealing with the governance. It is one part of this topic. The other part is quite different. At FIUC-IFCU, we are currently launching a specific program which is called Universities at Risk. It means that in many countries all around the world, some of our universities are living in countries at risk, because they are Catholic, and so because very often they are a minority in their country, they can face some discrimination. But in fact, the reasons for discrimination can be numerous. For instance, we have a university in Africa which that faces discriminations because it is an English-speaking university in a country where the majority is a French-speaking population. And so all around the world, we know that our universities face some political risk that could be very different, but we must pay attention to this risk. I've just mentioned reputational risk, and I think that this risk, in the opinion of several specialists, have become the category of risk comprising both the most important and the most complex issues for universities, especially because of the presence and impact of social media. Corinne was mentioning that as higher education has become a global market, branding was very important. And so if branding is important, damage to image and reputation then becomes risk that must be strictly controlled. Reputational damage can quickly wipe out years of efforts to build a brand image of the university and attract students, faculty, researchers, and interest in the development of university philanthropy. It can have also an impact in terms of philanthropy, of course. Pierre mentioned the other risk, which is on my list, the risk linked to the protection of research. And this topic can be organized around three main aspects: the protection of research results, the protection of research in sensitive areas, and finally, the uncertainty between the development of research linked to national issues in terms of research and development, and the research policy, which is based on international cooperation. And we can see the current rivalry for a vaccine against COVID-19 now totally includes, it is totally included in this aspect. Of course, there is also geopolitical risk linked to the position of Catholic in the world. I just mentioned that Catholic people are a minority in many countries, but yesterday Kirk rose a very interesting problem, mentioning that one of the impact of the coronavirus crisis was the tensions between China and Australia, and that it has an impact of the number of foreign students that could come to Australia. It's a very good example of what we can call a geopolitical risk. And of course, we could have some other examples in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and probably also in Europe. Other risk, I just mentioned it, a terrorist risk. I have in mind when I wrote this risk, the French situation, because many of our universities, Catholic universities in France, in fact, have been the subject of direct threats and therefore must have some specific protection measures. And I think that this risk can be also shared in some other countries. And finally, of course, there is the current health crisis, so the pandemic risk. We know, and since yesterday, we have noticed several impacts of this crisis, the problem of repatriation of students that Marie-Claude mentioned yesterday, for instance, or the expected decline in international recruitment that was noticed by Corinne a few minutes ago. Of course, the financial risk with parents of students requesting reimbursement for the semester due to the cancelled courses, for instance, not or little replaced, or due to educational continuity not mentioned in the contract between the student and the establishment. So all these risks lead the federation, lead IFCU to believe that a risk management position, and here Catholic risk management position, should be considered. And it is in this perspective that I will propose you to be involved in a collaborative and collaborative process during the following weeks. The idea is to create an academic risk management framework. Why? There is, I think, three main reasons that I wrote on the slide. First of all, and it has been underlined at several occasions since yesterday, Corinne mentioned it also a few minutes ago, higher education has become, in fact, not only a real market, but a field of specific activities with its own risk, and all what has been said today can be included in this first reason. There is also a second reason. The question which was about the system, just before my intervention, the question for Pierre, how can we organize a specific system, or how can we have a specific risk management team? This question, before answering this question, I think that we must have a specific culture of risk management in our universities, and so that we have to spread a risk management culture within our universities to discuss our practices, and it will be one of the main topics of our work during the next weeks. And of course, the main reason, or the last reason, is to limit risk, to prevent them, and to work together to manage them. In fact, we have the members of IFCU are located all around the world, and we are all living in very diverse situations. But I think that it would be very interesting to share our experiences and try to have a global common framework, even if, according to our situations, we can stress more one aspect than another. Just for giving you a comparison, Pierre knows that framework very well. In fact, you have several associations of risk managers that exist. One of them, Amorai Association, has published a specific risk management framework, and I say that we could be inspired by this first framework. There are, in fact, three parts in this kind of charter. The first one is a definition of what is risk management. Pierre has just given us also a definition. I think that there are, in fact, two possibilities. We can have a global definition of what is risk management, and we can try also to adapt this definition to the specificities of the academic world, and more specifically to the Catholic academic work. So it could be one part of our work to share our perceptions about what is risk management. Yesterday, I've seen that some of the participants were coming, for instance, from India. I was in India. I attended the executive board meeting last year. It was in September in the north of India, and I reminded that the situation that was described was very difficult. And so, if I just compare the situation of Catholic Catholic universities and colleges in India to the French situation, I think that we could have at the same time the same global approach, but that it will be also necessary to adapt or to be more precise because our situations are also quite different. So the first part of this framework is a definition of what is risk management. The second part is about the aims of risk management, and you can see that there are 4 aims. Once more, I think that we could try to adapt what are the aims of risk management according to the specificities of Catholic higher education and Catholic universities, and according also what I mentioned just before about the specificities of our organizations, because there is a great specificity. Even when we compare public university, Catholic university, we can see some differences that we must take into account when we want to define what are the aims of this risk management. Anyway, you can see that the aims are related to what Pierre has just told us. I mean, to create, preserve the value, assets, and reputation of the company. You can find with reputation one of the risks that I've just mentioned before. Of course, to safeguard decision-making and processes, which are very important. And I think that these topics must be integrated, in fact, in a global understanding of what are the aims of our executive committee or administrative board in our university. So there is a work to do to be as near as possible to the specificities of our organizations. Third part of this charter, the definition of what is the risk manager position. So once more, I will be brief, as Pierre has mentioned this aspect. But in fact, I think that once more, even if there is a global risk manager definition, we must adapt also this definition to our organizations because they are very specific. We have also to, I could say, to adapt this position to the specific articulation between all the dimensions of a faculty. Sometimes it seems as if the Catholic University was a very important organization, and when you better know the kind of organization that prevails, then you understand that in fact it is that there are some, how can I say, several faculties, several institutions which are not working exactly in the same perspectives. And so it is a specificities that must be taken into account in the work of definition, what is a risk manager position in our university. So if I want to go further, how can we work together? What I could propose you is to create a work group, a common work group, so that we can work all together in order to define what are the risks for a Catholic university. I mentioned some of them. Of course, I'm sure that if we work together, we will find some other risks that I have not mentioned. We have also to integrate into our approach, I think, a work at several levels. Yesterday, it was very important and very interesting to listen to the general secretaries of our regional associations of Catholic universities. And I think that we must include these regional associations, those of you who are interested in joining us, and of course the staff of FIUC-IFCU. And then when we will have shared our approaches about this risk, I think that we will be able to work on the risk manager position according to what I have already mentioned. I mean the specificities of our faculties. So, and the last step, of course, that I have already mentioned will be the organization of specific trainings next year, probably during the first semester, so that we can train those of you who are interested in going further on this topic. So the interested people among you will receive a short questionnaire, which will be the starting point of our collective work. I just end now my intervention, and of course I will be very pleased to discuss with you on the several risks that I've mentioned, and of course on the process that I've just explained. Thank you. Okay. So, are there any questions? No, at first. Okay, yes, Marie.
I think that Carla from Beirut might be writing a comment in the Q&A section. My question is about risk management and the issue specifically related to internationalization.
Issue specifically related to internationalization, yes. And so what is the question?
I'm thinking that maybe Carla is asking as to how is risk, what would be the specific issues around our topic?
I think that I mentioned some of them. For instance, the political risk, of course, according to the specific situations of our Catholic universities in some countries. The second one is about geopolitical risk, because some of our universities are located in countries at risk or in some geographical area that face some specific tensions, of course. I could mention, of course, the health issue or pandemic issue that we are just facing now. I think that those three risks are perhaps the more important one.
Yes, and if I can add, Francois, to your answer, which is you're totally right. I think that, and I mentioned the word risk taxonomy early during my presentation, and Pierre has also touched to it by talking about categories of risk. What are the different categories to look at when you perform risk management? Francois, you went even more into the details by naming those risks. So when you perform risk management, what you want to look at is the entire taxonomy of your institution, and then bring in the perspective from your department or your area of activity. So the issues that are related to internationalization are the same ones in terms of finances and reputation and operations and legal. And so all the categories that were mentioned by Pierre and all of the examples that you gave, Francois, are part of that risk mapping that should be looked into when you perform risk management. So that's why it's so important to, when I commented on Pierre's presentation about maybe feeling overwhelmed about the task. That's why you have, and Pierre really mentioned that it's not a one-man show. It's about bringing all the stakeholders that are involved in your area of activity in your institution and bring in that information so that you can really develop work on those scenario-based analysis with all of the input and all of the information that is required to identify well and be ready to develop those procedures and SOPs and protocols, and sometimes it's just some paperwork that you need to put in place prior for departure or when you greet international students. So one thing that's interesting also is to develop that administrative sequence of when you should be doing things and how it should be done, and that's based on your governance. So working on your policy for safety is crucial, because that's how you're going to get all of your stakeholders on board, understanding the importance of developing those positioning and having the finances and the human resources to develop your plan. So all of that information that you've received in the last 2 days is a gem. It's just a bowl filled with diamonds, and taking the time to unleash it and analyze it and digest it is going to take a little bit of time. But I feel that Francois' framework, what you're offering to the IFCU, is very interesting, and that could be of great support for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marie-Claude. In fact, I was thinking that our Foresight unit has published a very interesting document a few months ago, written by Jeff Saunders. It is a document about foresight and Catholic universities. And in this document, if I well remember, but Corinne, you can take the floor for precising the things. If I well remember, Jeff was detailing 3 environments for universities, and we could say that the governance of risk could be divided in these 3 environments. It's a way for thinking risk. Of course, you're right, Michael, there is a lot of taxonomies about risk. We could also divide internal risk or national risk or risk that are related to the administration of a university. What you have said yesterday about procedures, about compliance or non-compliance, it was what I was just saying when I mentioned organizational risk. Universities are restrained or constrained by norms, by several documents, official documents emerging from our governance, and we are obliged, of course, to respect laws, norms, and so on. At the same time, as we are Catholics, sometimes there are some specificities, and it was Why I thought it was interesting to have that in mind, because it could create some specific categories of risk for us. But all that anyway is a kind of internal risk or related to the fact that we are a specific organization. The other parts are related to the global environments. And then, of course, we can compare once more the risk that any organization are facing, a company, for instance, what a higher education institution will have to face, and probably it will be quite different for a part, and then what a Catholic institution will have to face. I can just give another example. Montserrat, who is responsible of a research center, and she's online. She can also explain better than me the topic, but she has worked through the last 3 years about for the creation of a specific framework about the social responsibility of universities, of Catholic universities. It was a very interesting, complex, hard job. Of course, there is the same framework for the social responsibility of company. But when I say there is a same framework, in fact, I'm wrong. For a part, the framework can be compared, but for a part, it's quite different, because an organization, an education institution, even if it has some profits to gain, is different, is quite different from just a company. And I think that one of the challenge for us will be in the future to understand what kind of differences we can find, or perhaps we should find, between the risks that are facing by a company and this specific organization, which is a Catholic university.
Very interesting. François, I'd like to bounce off what you mentioned about Montserrat's work and the importance of defining an institution's social responsibility and developing a framework. I highly believe that there is a strong correlation between social responsibility and risk management when it comes to keeping our people safe. Because that's what we want. Ultimately, we want our people that travel abroad to come back home in, safely and healthy. And that's not only a legal, well, it's a legal obligation in many of the countries around the world. But first and foremost, I think it's a social responsibility, and it's an ethical and moral question that each institution has to really dive into, to understand that, well, if it's not obligated for me to act, what is my ethic and what is my moral around having to intervene or having to protect? And because you can, the legal aspect only goes so far. Your due diligence is important, but sometimes you can do even furthermore, and that falls into your social responsibility in the sense that you want to act in the best interest of your community and the environment in which your institution evolves. And that puts your people at the center of all of your actions and decisions. And I think there's a good correlation there. It's important to create links between those two.
And what you have just said, Marie-Claude, is for a part, I think, a response also to what Carla mentioned. She wrote it is useful to have a comprehensive approach, but my concern is that the assessment and managing of international activities will become secondary when considered at the global level of our higher education institutions. If I can say that it's a risk, but I think that it is also the work that we have to do to articulate the several dimensions of risk management approach, of course.